When we tried to come up with this year's theme, we tried out a lot of different ideas, such as galvanization, both the burning and building of bridges, and my personal favorite, Trollgate. But at the end of nearly an hour of progressively worse names, we finally landed on one that we felt spoke to the underlying ideas of the event as a whole: Renaissance. The word Renaissance has different meanings to each of us. For some, it is the redefining of our world as we know it, and for others, it could simply be deciding to make a change in your life. Regardless of how big or small your renaissance is, above all things, a renaissance represents rebirth, and that is what we hope to accomplish in today's event. Today, we have speakers who are covering vastly different topics. From the etymology of outer space to the meaning of life, our speakers have each in their own way talked about a renaissance, ones they have lived through and ones they hope to see. Each of them has done an amazing job, speaking about issues they care about and advocating for change, and we are so proud of all of them. So, without further ado, we'd like to welcome you all to TEDx TAMS.
If any of you guys are at least a few years older than I am, you probably remember 2006, when Pluto was demoted from its status as one of the 9 planets to its current status as a dwarf planet. I, being about 2.5 at the time, was not so deeply offended by this decision like many of the astronomers of the day were. While it is normal for astronomers to get heated over decisions like this, the redefinition of the word planet, which is what got Pluto demoted in the first place, remains to this day one of the International Astronomical Union's most egregious offenses. This is partially due to the fact that 7 months prior, the New Horizons probe, a mission sent to actually go and investigate Pluto, was launched. The astronomers working on the project felt like their contribution was being devalued. But it's partially due to the fact that the definition they ended up choosing, well, kind of sucks. I don't mean to be disrespectful or offensive, but it really is an awful definition. There's just not another way to put it. I can't make any claims as to why it hasn't been changed since 2006, but I can say that it ought to be replaced. To save Bill Nye and the rest of the IAU board some time, I've actually come up with what I believe is a much better definition. While my definition still excludes Pluto, I think you'll be very interested to hear that it also excludes Earth, but includes the Moon. To explain why this is the case, I'll first walk you through how we got to the definition we have now. I'll explain what exactly it is that's so wrong with it, and then I'll tell you what I would do to fix it. Astronomy has been around for about as long as people have. We've pretty much always been looking up at the sky. While much of early astronomy was based around folklore and mythos, every now and then the early astronomers would make an actual real scientific observation about what it was they were looking at. One interesting observation that pretty much every ancient civilization shared was that of 7 objects that move across the sky in a pattern different from the stars. These objects are the Sun, Mercury, Venus, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. While the stars are in fixed positions relative to each other, they'll always make the same constellations. These 7 objects move along an arc called the elliptical. The solar system rests more or less along one plane, and this means that from Earth's perspective, all the major bodies wander along the arc in the sky. These were the first planets. In fact, the word planet comes from the Greek word planetes, which means wanderer. So the number of planets started at 7, and it was defined as the wandering lights in the sky. Now, eventually Copernicus would postulate the heliocentric nature of the solar system, and Galileo would later prove it, which brought the number of planets down to 6 as the Sun and Moon were kicked out of the club and Earth was brought in. But it wasn't until 1781 that a new planet was discovered. William Herschel wanted to name his discovery George after the king, but the Astronomical Society thought that was inappropriate and chose the name Uranus instead. But we nudged the definition here and there, and now a planet is something that orbits the Sun. Let's stop in 1801 for a little detour. This is the year Ceres, the largest asteroid in the asteroid belt, and now the smallest dwarf planet, was discovered. It was actually classified as a planet initially. After all, what else do you call a round rocky object orbiting the Sun? So in 1801 we had 8 planets. But shortly after Ceres came Pallas, another rocky object orbiting the Sun in the general area. Then came Juno, then Vesta, then Astrea. That's 12 planets. More and more planets were popping up, and astronomers were starting to get a little worried. So they got together in 1850 to figure out what to do about all these new planets, which were now numbered at 18, since 6 more of Ceres' friends had joined the party, and Neptune, a regular old gas giant, had been discovered during this period. They decided to group Ceres and his little band of misfit planets into one group, which they called the asteroid belts. These were no longer planets, they were asteroids. We go back to 8 planets, since Neptune obviously got to stay, and now the definition of a planet is something big that orbits the Sun. Now we jump to 1930 when Pluto was discovered. Clyde Tombaugh was actually looking for a much larger planet, thought to be disturbing the orbits of Uranus and Neptune. It turned out that this disturbance was due to a faulty calculation of Neptune's mass, but in the sea of data astronomers had collected looking for this 9th planet, a little blip appeared. this turned out to be Pluto. Now, Uranus and Neptune, the planets that aren't visible in the night sky, are so much larger than and so much closer to Earth than Pluto is. It seems reasonable to expect that someone would stumble across them when surveying the night sky. But Pluto is very, very small and very, very far away. By all accounts, it shouldn't have been discovered for another 70 years. But astronomers in 1930 just so happened to be looking for another planet that should have appeared where Pluto happened to be sitting at. So Pluto was accepted in 1930, and we had 9 planets. This wouldn't be challenged until the turn of the 21st century, when something very familiar started happening. A round rock a good leap beyond Neptune's orbit called Quaoar was discovered in 2002 by Mike Brown and Chadwick Trulio. It was first classified as an asteroid, though it was much larger than your standard space rock. In fact, it was larger than Ceres. Then came Sedna in 2003, my personal favorite of the dwarf planets. Soon after came Haumea in 2004. If you're having flashbacks to the early 1800s, you're not alone. Just like with the asteroid belts, astronomers were starting to realize that maybe these clustered, similarly sized objects shouldn't be considered planets, which is what they were thinking they might have to classify them as. Since they hadn't actually started calling them planets yet, per se, they were actually comfortable keeping Pluto where it was and just calling the rest of them trans-Neptunian objects for the time being. But this was so long as they didn't find one larger than Pluto. Hey, you want to know what happened in 2005? Eris, a round rock past Neptune's orbit with a mass larger than Pluto's, was discovered, which meant the IAU had to finally pin down what it actually meant to be a planet. They ended up deciding on the following. In order for an object to be considered a planet, it has to meet 3 criteria. 1. It must orbit the sun without orbiting anything else. 2. It must have enough mass to maintain a near-round shape. And 3. It must have cleared the debris from its orbit. I have a problem with this definition. Technically, none of the 8 planets meet all 3 criteria. Starting with the first criterion, I have 3 major criticisms. The first is that nothing in our solar system actually orbits the sun. When a set of objects gravitationally interact, they orbit the system's center of mass. You'd think this would be somewhere within the sun, seeing as it contains 99% of the solar system's mass and has a radius of over 400,000 miles, but this actually isn't the case. As it turns out, Jupiter and Saturn are massive enough to pull that center of gravity outside the sun's radius. So everything in the solar system orbits this, including the sun, which means nothing actually orbits the sun. My second criticism is that this criterion excludes everything outside of the solar system. The definition specifies the sun, which would make all exoplanets, which are planet-sized objects that orbit other stars, not planets. You would think those 2 terms would overlap, but they don't. The third criticism I have is that it also excludes rogue planets, which are planet-sized objects that don't orbit anything in particular. Compositionally, they're the same as star-orbiting objects, they just happen to be located somewhere else. Moving forward, I'm actually not quite so mad at the second criterion. It has a pretty precise specification. For something to be considered near-round, it has to have reached what's called hydrostatic equilibrium. For astronomical purposes, this just means symmetrically rounded, but there is a precise way to measure it. Now, despite popular belief, Pluto actually does meet this criterion. It's the third one that got it kicked, and we'll see why later. Despite this, I still do have one criticism of this criterion. While it does clearly specify a lower bound for the mass of planets, it doesn't specify an upper bound. And this turns out to be kind of problematic. The largest planet-type objects are called gas giants, and they're not too compositionally different from stars. What distinguishes gas giants from stars is the presence or absence of nuclear fusion, which is what makes stars shine. If an object made of hydrogen and helium gets massive enough, it will start to fuse hydrogen atoms together to make helium, which releases a huge amount of energy. The problem is that this line isn't quite so distinct as you'd think it would be. There's a blurred area between planets and stars, which is where brown dwarfs reside. Often called failed stars or overachieving planets, they don't really fit into either classification. While they don't fuse hydrogen to make helium, they accumulate matter much differently than gas giants do, and they're comprised of much less metal. The planet definition should resolve this confusion, and I'd argue that that's part of its primary purpose. Now we move to the third criterion, which is the one that Pluto and the other trans-Neptunian objects violate. They were excluded from the Planet Club because they're part of what's now known as the Kuiper Belt. Similar to the asteroid belt, it's a region where smaller rocky and icy objects congregate. This means they violate the third criterion, which states they must have cleared debris within their orbit. I've been a bit picky with the first two criterion. They can probably be resolved with a couple minor modifications, but the third criterion is just awful. After a bit of consideration and a lot of math, astronomers realized that clearing the debris has nothing to do with the properties of the object in question, but rather just where it's located. If Earth was suddenly teleported to the Kuiper Belt, it would no longer be a planet. It's not gravitationally prominent enough to sweep all that matter up. Like the first criterion, this one judges an object by the place they live, instead of by their character. But it gets worse. By this classification, Mars and Jupiter aren't planets. To help you understand why, I first need to explain what Lagrange points and Trojan objects are. When one object orbits another, 5 gravity wells form along the smaller body's orbit, numbered L1 to L5. These are called Lagrange points. These regions tend to catch passing asteroids and comets if the well is big enough, and when they do, that cosmic debris stays there and becomes what's called a Trojan object. It's thought that Jupiter's Lagrange points are part of the reason we have complex life on Earth. They catch most civilization-ending asteroids. We found a lot of terrestrial bodies in the habitable zone orbiting other stars, but a lot of them don't have a gas giant keeping all the asteroids away. Mars and Jupiter have a particularly large amount of Trojans on their L4 and L5 points. And I'm not sure about you, but a bunch of asteroids hanging out within a planet's orbit sounds a lot like uncleared debris. So now we know each criterion is flawed in one way or another. Nothing orbits the sun, we have no upper bound for the mass of a planet, clearing the debris has nothing to do with the properties of the object, and Mars and Jupiter should have been demoted with Pluto. This definition as a whole is also just over-exclusionary. All of these flaws just make you wonder why this was implemented in the first place. I obviously can't speak for the IAU, but I think the reason they chose this definition isn't too hard to figure out. Up until 2006, the definition was just a list that changed with every new discovery, but there wasn't really a need for a formal way to categorize space rocks because on the rare occurrence that something new was discovered, its categorization had always been fairly obvious. But by 2006, we had the technology to see to the edge of our solar system and beyond, in enough detail to completely discern comparatively tiny worlds. And we were realizing that there were a lot of these worlds. Not all of them should be considered planets. So we knew we finally had to pin down the definition if we wanted to better understand these new discoveries. The problem was they just didn't want to shake things up too much. It was obvious Pluto needed to go, but they didn't want to mess with the other planets. They didn't want to change too much, so they did what we'd always been doing. And they just nudged the definition a bit until it conformed to their list and only their list. The goal wasn't to create a working definition that could be used to help classify new discoveries ad infinitum. Their goal was to account for the recent discoveries while maintaining as much of the status quo as possible. It's disappointing because I think if they'd taken that opportunity to really think about the purpose of the definition and how it actually would be used in the future, they would have realized that they needed to flip the current system on its head. I think this issue is a microcosm of a much larger issue in the world. Whether it be in politics, economics, or social structures, I think we frequently pass up the opportunity to really think critically about the systems that cause the problems in our world. We're much more willing to try short-term solutions because they aren't as disruptive. We like to maintain as much of the status quo as we can and just nudge policy a bit to account for the new symptoms of the larger problem. This isn't how meaningful change happens. But enough about problems, let's talk about solutions. I might not be able to fix the global economy, but I think I can fix the way we classify planets. I've been bitter about this definition for the past 7 years, and I'm very eager to finally propose a way to fix it. After all, I did promise to explain to you why I think the moon should be a planet. So first, I want you to forget about the word planet, just for a bit. I actually don't think we should continue using it in a scientific context. Because all of the historical connotations and rebranding it's gone through, it no longer has the perceived sense of exactness that's actually useful in science. We all have an idea of what a planet should be, but a lot of those objects are so compositionally dissimilar that it doesn't make sense to use it for formal classifications. I mean, just compare Jupiter and Mercury, they're absurdly different in size, composition, and placement. So when we discover a new smallish, roundish object, I think we should place it in one of 3 categories. 1. Gas giants. Spheres of gas that don't undergo nuclear fusion. Note that this category includes brown dwarfs now. 2. Major terrestrial worlds. Objects that are in hydrostatic equilibrium, or are just round, and made of rock. Within this category, we can specify whether the rock in question is orbiting a star, is a satellite of something else, or is just on its own. I want to mention, just a little side note here, that while I do want to remove the word planet from scientific contexts, I absolutely want to keep the word planet, that is spelled with a B, as in black hole. This is the real, actual scientific word for round things orbiting black holes. Astronomers come up with some of the best vocab terms. Just ask the people who coined the two types of dark matter, which are called machos and wimps. Anyway, the third category would be for rocks that aren't at hydrostatic equilibrium. They'd either be asteroids or comets based on their ice content. So now we have a way to sort out our rocks and gas clouds, and now we can look back at the word planet. I don't think it's reasonable to think that people will stop using this word. It's deeply embedded in the public conscious, and it's been around for literally centuries. I see no reason as to why we have to get rid of it completely anyway. So, how to define it? I propose we go back to the beginning. Observational astronomy is considered one of the first sciences. It's always been important to humanity. Even though folklore varied from region to region, almost every ancient civilization noticed the same 7 lights wandering across the sky. I think maybe we could define planet in honor of these people who became the foundation of modern science. So, to me, a planet is a natural object that moves along the elliptical and is visible to the naked eye, which means that my planets are the Sun, Mercury, Venus, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So maybe sometimes it's necessary to flip the definition on its head if we want to make useful change. When we're given the opportunity to reevaluate the structures our issues are built upon, I hope we can learn to challenge the status quo a bit more often.
Hello, my name is Bhavik Tadigotla, and I'm going to talk about our tendency to deny our problems and how we need to accept them if we want change. I love food. Anything from rich, fluffy, chocolatey Oreo pancakes to green and stale Chick-fil-A salads, I'm all up for it. Now, this wasn't really a healthy obsession, and it became so bad that I would eat that I would keep pushing the problem away. Deep down, I understood that all body types were absolutely amazing and should definitely be accepted, but I always faced the problem with how I viewed myself. I used eating as a way to avoid my real emotions and refused to acknowledge the toll that it took on both my health and my happiness. And I'm not alone. According to Jerome Adams, the former Surgeon General of the United States of America, he says that our inability to accept the truth is a much, much greater risk to adolescence than drugs, poverty, and even gang membership. And from my personal experience, I'm inclined to agree with that. Our constant denial of the truth is so widespread that it is a problem. And that's exactly what I'm worried about. Our generation's failure to accept. We fail to accept the truth. We fail to accept our challenges. And ultimately, we fail to accept ourselves. Now, it's important that we understand that our denialism stretches out way, way further than just you and me. It affects everyone in every continent, region, and corner of the world. For example, if we take the case of the pandemic, as CNN writer Meghan Markle puts it, with so much information available about the severity of the coronavirus and the need to follow guidelines, some people still refuse to accept the reality. People are saying that they want to get the virus just to get this whole thing over with, because they don't believe that COVID-19 really is that bad. Our denial of the severity of this virus and its devastating effects is literally putting our lives and the lives of thousands and thousands of other people at grave risk. And if we take the example of the Black Lives Matter movement, an amazing social movement that advocated for justice, healing, and freedom, its core principles were stemmed from a long period of racial negligence and lack of care for equality. And while individuals have denied systemic racism in many places, we've come to realize that it definitely is a problem, and we are taking baby steps to rectifying those mistakes that should have been corrected a really long time ago. Because one of the greatest sources of unhappiness that we experience as humans sprouts from us having the difficulty of accepting things for what they are. As the Association for Psychological Science puts it, apart from the emotional and mental stress that denialism puts on us, there are a very, very serious multitude of physical conditions that we could also experience. Anything from immune system failure, neurological illnesses, and even premature death. So you see, our self-deceiving nature isn't really good for anything except for pain and destruction. And this is a problem, because it became a problem when I didn't accept that I was overweight. It becomes a problem when we turn a blind eye to the murderers of innocent Black men and women. And it will continue to become a problem if we ignore a virus that has killed over 1 million people. Our sickening mindset has started to plague everyone, and we need to do everything we can to reverse it. To put it plain and simple, we've spent our entire lives trying to come up with a language of denial to try and deceive us and the people around us. Our inherent desire to look like the perfect human beings, even if we aren't, is actually harming us more than we think. We try and hide our shortcomings by using denial as a veil. We run away from them and hope no one notices, when in reality, our self-deception doesn't hurt anyone except for us and the ones around us. Now, it's important that we acknowledge our shortcomings and take active steps to becoming better. While change definitely is a struggle, it always results in some type of success, whether that's improving your grades, increasing your salary, or just learning to appreciate yourself. So you see, us Westerners have a pretty impractical approach of acceptance. We strive for perfection in everything that we do, even when that's not possible. But on the Eastern side of the world, there's a revolutionizing mindset spreading across Asia like wildfire. Wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi stresses the importance of accepting what you have and not thinking about what you don't. Wabi-sabi loosely translates to acceptance and appreciation of what is and not of what must be. So let's look to the acronym ME, M and E, to teach us how to accept ourselves just the way we are. M, make out. Now, don't get too excited. What I want you to do is make out a list of 10 things that you don't like about yourselves. It could literally be anything. Something you feel about your personality, secrets that you've kept hidden away from your loved ones, anything that you look back on and feel ashamed of. 10 things that you're scared about sharing with other people and exposing them to everyone else will really, really help you. Because as human beings, we like to keep our insecurities as secure as possible. But when it comes to understanding ourselves, our community, and even our world, it's extremely important that we know what to accept. E, educate. Educate yourself with inspirational stories. It's extremely important that we have someone that we can look up to that can inspire us to accept ourselves. In fact, the American Academy of Children's Psychiatry states that children with a role model are more willing to work on themselves as a person than those that do not. Especially during the pandemic, when we have so much free time on our hands, it'll be good for us if we educate ourselves on people that had to overcome their own hurdles in order to accept themselves as unique individuals. So let's try and do that. Let's accept that it's important to be healthy. Let's accept that hard work leads to success. And let's accept that change only comes when we are ready for it. Thank you so much.
I'd like to get us started off with a story from a couple of weeks back. The other day, I was at a McDonald's with a friend of mine from my old high school. And this kid, he was always a sort of techie, computer-oriented kind of guy. So back when we were in person, I'd always find him working on some new project in the computer science labs after school. Now, we were just shooting the breeze over our milkshakes, and I was asking those questions you'd ask to catch up with really any other guy nowadays. How's this year been for you? I prodded him, and he responds, You know, things have been pretty tough at school because of you know what. And I go, tell me about it. Class has just been terrible because of everything being online and all that. Well, he begins, my classes have been pretty fine at least. It's just all the clubs that we have to join. One day I have to catch up with Psychology Club. The next day I have to write a speech for Model United Nations. The day after that I have to do A, B, and C for X, Y, and Z clubs. And I stop him there. I didn't know you were in all that stuff, I tell him. I always thought you were more of a computer science kind of guy. And he replies, I don't care about any of this. You know how it is. It's all for college. You don't care about any of it? I ask him. Nope. As soon as I get to UT Austin and I start studying computer science, I'm dropping every last bit of it. And that got me thinking, because I've had a similar train of thought myself. Whenever some new club opportunity pops up or some new leadership request arises, I sometimes have to stop myself from thinking, well, will this look good to colleges? And as I begin the college application process myself, I'm looking back at my high school career, and I'm asking, is it worth it to deny who you are in an effort to become more like who you think you should be? Is it right to throw away your passions so that you can tick off a couple more checkboxes on a list? Is it true to yourself when you say that you're someone whom you are not? And quite frankly, I think the answer to that is no. Now, each person has their own unique set of desires. We all want different things, we all set different goals, and we all aspire to be different people. But underscoring those desires is a universal framework of needs. In 1943, Abraham Maslow recognized this and argued that everyone's driven by a common hierarchy of needs. The lower levels of that hierarchy represent more basic material needs, while the upper levels of that hierarchy represent more abstract needs related to personal development and aspiration. At the bottom of the hierarchy are our physiological needs. Those needs related to food, water, warmth, sleep. And above that physiological layer comes our safety needs. In other words, our need to feel physically safe and secure wherever we are. Now, above those two basic sets of needs, things get interesting. On top of safety are our needs related to belonging and love, or our desire for human connection. And above that comes our esteem needs, our drive to feel like we've accomplished something with our lives. And at the very top of that whole hierarchy, once all said and done, our final need is our need for self-actualization. We want to know that we've accomplished our full potential as human beings. Now let's take a step back. Let's look back at that hierarchy for a second. Beyond the basic needs, every single level is about your own development as a person. Our belonging and love needs, they're not just about getting approval from as many people as possible. No, they're about developing quality relationships with those that we care about. Our esteem needs, they're not about hitting arbitrary milestones or filling out lines on a resume. They're about being proud of who we are. And our self-actualization needs at the very top, they're about being the best person we can be. A lot of folks our age, they do the things they do so that they can just get into some top-tier college and start shaping who they are in the future. But I think we sometimes forget the choices we make now in high school. How we choose to lead, how we choose to explore, and how we choose to interact. They're also going to shape who we are as adults in the future. Now, our lives are driven by these needs, but along the way, many of us are going to face internal conflicts and struggles. Sure, we'll have a tough time with some of our classes. We might face minor setbacks, but we'll also have to ask deeper questions about who we are, what we're here for, and what place we have in the world. In the late 20th century, Erik Erikson developed his theory of psychosocial development. Now, in this theory, every person goes through several stages in their life, each one having an existential question. For an infant at the beginning of his life, learning about the world for the first time, that question is, can I trust the world? For a young adult seeking romance, that question is, can I find love? And for an older person looking back on their life, that question is, have I lived a fulfilling life? Erikson identified the adolescent stage of life as the time for us to solidify our identity. In this stage, we look to the future and we ask ourselves, who am I? And who can I be? If we can find an answer to these questions, then we become secure in our identities. But if we can't find an answer, we fall into identity crisis. According to Erikson, if an adolescent lets their future be defined by external forces like societal expectations or parental wishes, they'll effectively put an end to the search for identity without finding an actual identity. Instead, he argues, adolescents should be free to explore their passions with those they care about, so that they can develop a healthy sense of who they are and what they stand for. Many of us have one more year left. One more year of high school. One more year before we become adults. One more year to figure things out before we go to college. And while we do have our responsibilities to take care of, let's take care not to drown in them. Instead, I figure that we should take more time out of our lives to hang out with our friends and do the fun things that get us excited. After all, it's those times that'll allow us to answer the defining questions of our futures. Who are we? What are we here for? And what's next for us? I'm Ted Kwee-Bintoro. Thanks for listening.
I was about 12 when I first realized that small, private Christian schools in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico teach a more accurate and in-depth representation of history than large public schools in Texas. In Clovis, New Mexico, we had a month-long lesson during Black History Month, at the end of which we each wrote an essay on Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech that would be presented at the annual MLK Day brunch. In Allen, Texas, though, we were taught that the South seceded during the Civil War because of states' rights. And in Clovis, we learned about Emmett Till and the, to say the least, complicated race relations in America, while in Allen, I didn't even hear the name Breonna Taylor. It is all too easy in today's world, as well as the past, to ignore truths that we don't want to hear. While yes, states did secede because they wished for the protection of their states' rights, the only real right that they fought to protect was the right to beat, murder, rape, break African Americans, and everyone whose skin was just a little too dark or whose facial features were just a little too different from traditional Caucasian features. But none of these things are mentioned. The only words that seem to be uttered are states' rights. This blatant miseducation cannot continue further into the future. The American school system needs to rethink the way it approaches history and who it chooses to honor with its silence as to the controversial natures of so many historically significant figures. Children today are taught about the brave Christopher Columbus, peaceful Mahatma Gandhi, George Washington, etc. But they are not being taught the whole truth. While children are being taught that Columbus was the first person to discover America, this is not even close to being the truth. He certainly did not discover America, much less was he even the first European to visit the so-called New World. All that Columbus truly did was enslave the native people and set a precedent for the mistreatment of and hatred toward people with differences in America. And Gandhi, well, yes, his work for the Indian independence movement was unparalleled. We also cannot ignore the fact that he was, to say the least, problematic in his private life. He was a racist.
In his early writings from South Africa, Gandhi wrote that white people should be the predominating race in that region. He said that black people are troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals. He was a misogynist as well as a sexual predator. He used female members of his ashrams to carry out experiments on his sexuality that included bathing, sleeping, and receiving messages from these women while they were naked, even his own grandniece, who was only 18 at the time. Even America's founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and 39 others out of the 56 who signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. George Washington owned 123 human beings at the time of his death, and his wife owned 153 enslaved people. Washington ordered an enslaved person to be whipped for simply walking on the lawn. He aggressively hunted down runaways, and he took great pains to prevent his slaves from mistakenly being freed while visiting free states. Even as Jefferson penned the words that became the foundation of America, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The only people truly included in this statement were white men. This isn't all to say that students today shouldn't learn about these historical figures. Simply ignoring them and erasing them from history would be just as unthinkable as progressing in our willful ignorance. I merely mean to say that there should be a proper and factual education, that students learn the truth about these figures and so many more, that the history they are taught paints as untouchable, that there's more than just a 1-week lesson about important African Americans during Black History Month, and that we take a deeper dive into the truly amazing women who made today's reality, while by no means perfect, a possibility during Women's History Month, as well as with so many marginalized groups in America. To help rectify this situation, I support the New York Times 1619 project, which has led to the development of curriculums and lesson plans based on the idea that U.S. history began not in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but in August of 1619, when more than 20 enslaved Africans were brought to Point Comfort, Virginia, and explores the history of slavery in our country and how it has influenced every single aspect of life in the United States. We can no longer ignore the divisions that pervade America. We need to address the history of these divisions to finally put a stop to them, so that we can get to a place where there are no more Emmett Tills, Eric Garners, Michael Browns, Tamir Rices, Walter Scotts, Alton Sterlings, Philando Castiles, Stephon Clarks, Breonna Taylors, George Floyds, and Dante Wrights.
Technology is something we use every day to work, to play, and even just to communicate with others. There are a lot of different varieties and options we can choose to utilize technology with. Despite its prevalence in our lives, not many people actually know a lot about the technology they even use. You may know that, your smartphone allows you to connect with others via the internet or through telephone. You may also know that you can have a lot of entertaining mediums, such as movies and even video games. Despite the sort of ubiquity of technology, as I said before, it's not really fully understood. We may not understand the underlying decisions and actions with a lot of technology. And today, I sort of want to talk about one snippet, one small yet infuriating experience with technology, and it's the word port. Now, when some people hear the word port, they might think of the English word, which is sort of like having ships arrive and depart with supplies. However, English is a pretty interesting language, right? And there are a lot of different meanings. Some people more familiar with technology and care a lot about Apple's removal of the headphone jack and other ports, they think of the word as sort of USB standards, or perhaps SD card, micro SD card. However, the word port that I want to use today refers to the action of moving one program from one platform to another. So what does that mean? Well, to give an analogy, you could imagine a software as sort of like a building. And so a building, of course, requires a foundation. And while generally foundations are made of concrete nowadays, you may discover that you may want to build something on a sandy foundation, or perhaps just a dirt foundation. And so can you just build the exact same building on the exact same way? No, you really can't, because the foundation's different. And so if we were to apply this foundation and building analogy to software, we would discover that the foundation is the software's platform, operating system. You may have heard of it, you may not. It's okay though. But the foundation is basically what your computer runs on. It's your Windows, your Mac OS, your Android, your iOS. And so with the platform, app developers, coders can build a lot of buildings for it, the apps. However, when they try to move one app to another, of course it's much easier than construction. You can copy and paste the code. However, just copy and pasting the exact same code onto a new foundation may not result in the exact same experience. It may be dangerous. I personally wouldn't live on a sandy foundation, for example, without full reassurance from the engineers. And here's something to remember. Coding is also engineering. There's a lot of thought and processes behind the code itself. It's not some sort of magic. And I kind of want to talk about just perhaps some insight into why it's not magic, and sort of, just talk about some of the problems that arise from porting. So we know that you can't copy and paste buildings, right, onto different foundations. And so porting is basically retooling the building to accommodate the foundation. Sounds simple, right? Well, with code, it may not be as simple. Sure, sometimes it is pretty easy. Let's say porting one program on Android to a different Android phone. It's pretty easy. In fact, there may be no issues at all just copy and pasting the code. However, if you want to say run, let's say, a Windows program, it doesn't matter what it is. If you want to run a Windows program on your Android phone, you may not even know how to start. Like, how do I download it? And even if you have the Windows program on your phone, you may find it incredibly difficult to run. It may not open. And that's because the platforms are different. The foundation's different. And so the same building will have to be retooled for Android because the platform's foundations are so different. And so why am I talking about this? Well, first off, I have a sort of a personal anecdote, which I think is a pretty interesting case. So over the summer, I learned that I would be learning virtually. And so this isn't really a big deal, although one thing I did miss was the dorm life, the sort of social aspect, talking with other students, and of course my friends. And so what ended up happening was that some students at Stanford developed a web extension called Sesame to actually at least try to recreate this dorm life. Now, of course, it won't be the exact same, but it really does help alleviate the sort of isolation many felt, especially at the start, knowing that they wouldn't see their friends potentially for 2 semesters. And so what's the problem with Sesame? Well, nothing if you use Google Chrome, but I don't use Google Chrome. I use Firefox, and I've been using Firefox for the past few years. So I sort of had a fork at my feet. I could either give up Firefox and a lot of the things I liked about it, particularly just the sort of, I won't go into specifics, but I could either give up Firefox or I could give up Sesame, both of which I didn't really want to do. And so I just found the really frustrating experience of the issues with porting. Not with porting itself, but the lack of porting and general compatibility. And so what can you do when you find yourself in this situation? Well, you have 3 general options. You can either just wait for an official port to be released. you can try to find an alternative, or you can try porting it yourself or find other community members who can port it. So, while I won't talk explicitly about what I did right now, I'll talk about the first step, just waiting. Not step, but the first option. So, what's the benefit of waiting? Well, you get official support. You get a stance from the company that says, we support software on this platform. We support Microsoft Word on macOS. We support Instagram on Android. So having an official stance from the company is definitely reassuring. And along with this official stance is support. You know that you can always just call up support and ask, hey, there's a problem with the code, and they'll help you through it. Now, there is one really big downside, and it's waiting. You have no real power over the developers, and for good reason. After all, the developers have to make decisions to keep their app afloat. And if not enough people use a platform, let's say BlackBerry. Let's say there's not a lot of apps for BlackBerry because there's not a lot of users demanding for apps on BlackBerry phones, for example. And so it just doesn't make sense to spend so much time debugging, polishing up, porting the code, the building, remember, onto a platform which not many people are going to use. It makes more sense to just appeal and add new features to a larger audience. And so that's the big problem with the first version. You just kind of have to wait and hope. And so what about the second option, finding an alternative? Well, alternatives can definitely get the job done. If you have a time-sensitive task, you may just have to find an alternative software. And so, for example, let's say Adobe Premiere was not available on Linux, for example. Well, you would have to find an alternative software like KDE Live. And although you may gripe about how it's different, how some parts of it are different from Premiere, you can still get the job done. You can still edit your video. And in fact, you may actually grow fond of this alternative software. And option 2 is more of like a bridge between not having a port of your favorite software and having a port. And so during this time, you may grow more fond of this alternative software, or you may just remember why you like your original software in the first place. Regardless, alternative software, it's not going to be the same. And that's something that a lot of people aren't really willing to give up. And so what about the last option? Well, this is actually creating your own port, or at least finding some way to support software on unsupported platforms. And so how can you do this? Well, the most thorough way is to somehow have the program and take it apart, like a chair. You take the chair apart, you take the building apart, and then you design the modifications yourself to actually support different foundations. And so obviously, this takes a lot of skill and knowledge in the field, which not everybody really has the time or capabilities to do so. And also, there's no support. If something goes wrong, you have to figure out what's wrong. And that can take hours out of your day, especially if that's not your job. That's just frustrating for many. And so what are some other community-made ports, for example? Well, you can sort of sideload software. And for example, I'll actually talk about the option I chose when I came across this fork. I created a sort of port, in quotes. It's not the same port as I mentioned before, the thoroughness of actually taking apart the code and modifying it to work for Firefox. Instead, I actually found a way to sort of sideload Sesame. I am able to open Chrome up really fast, close Google Chrome, and just have Sesame remain as a separate window, even with the Sesame icon, which I thought was pretty cool. And so, as a result, there's some advantages of actually doing something like this. For example, you don't really need to update your own code every time an official update comes out. But there are a lot of downsides, obviously. For example, there's a lot more setup to go into it. And that also might not be something people are really looking forward to. So some people may ask, okay, that's a lot of talk for something that probably doesn't affect me. Well, that's true for now. However, a lot of companies and a lot of organizations are looking into a lot of different platforms. So you may have heard of this small company called Apple. They make a few electronic devices here and there, and they make some accessories. And so Apple is actually working on a new architecture, a new platform, a new foundation. And you may have heard of it. It's called the M1 chip. And so for those who are unfamiliar, M1 is essentially completely different from your traditional computer processing unit. It relies on different foundations, and all the buildings around it are completely different. And even though Apple has a translating layer, which is really cool and really effective, it will never be the same as a building designed for that foundation. It's sort of a band-aid to help the transition. Instead of people trying to find alternative software, they can run their favorite software. That's a lot of softwares, isn't it? But they can run their favorite programs on Apple M1 at a slight performance cost for now, instead of having to find an alternative. And so you may say, okay, Apple has found a solution, so why should I care still? Well, RISC-V is a much more obscure platform, but there's a lot of research going into it. And in 5-10 years, you may find yourself using a device that uses RISC-V, and you may have to face the issue of ports. You may find yourself at this three-way pathway. But in the end, what's really important is to really figure out that despite what companies try to say, that technology is magic, surprise, there are humans that coded it. They're not wizards. They're just engineers. And like the chair, hammers, houses, basically anything that people make, you can always take it apart. You can always ask, why is it built like this? Why can't I do this? The magic isn't in the product. The magic is in the questions that we ask.
Self-driving cars have been catching media headlines for the past decade. From self-driving cars are right around the corner to autonomous vehicles will end accidents on the road, it seems as if most of humanity's biggest problems are going to be solved soon by autonomous vehicles. However, the media has unknowingly created a false perception of the current self-driving car technology and its benefits. Autonomous cars will play a role in ending many problems, but there are so many obstacles that need to be solved before self-driving cars solve problems instead of creating more. Autonomous vehicles are broken down into different levels, where level 0 means no autonomy and level 5 means full autonomy. Most cars today fall into the second and third category, where they can mostly drive by themselves but still need human supervision. But one major problem has to be solved for us to reach full autonomy: weather. See, most cars today can drive around autonomously, but being able to drive in terrible weather conditions, such as a snowstorm, is difficult for humans, let alone an AI. The main reason behind this is that sensors and cameras aren't able to perfectly identify objects in their surrounding area, which is a big problem because that's the only way the car is able to see. What this means for someone who owns a self-driving car is that your car will shut down or crash into something in bad weather condition because it's not able to properly perceive the environment it's in. Radar has proven to be successful in being able to see in horrible weather condition, but it has another problem: not being able to capture the full picture of the road scene, such as the shape and size of oncoming vehicles. The solution to this problem would have to be drastically improving radar so that it would be able to function similar to LiDAR, in the sense that it can accurately detect the setting at any given moment. Another problem is mapping. Almost all autonomous vehicles today require a detailed map of an area before it's able to properly drive in that area. Let's take Waymo for example. Waymo is a ride-hailing service similar to Uber, but it uses self-driving cars. Before they can launch in a city, they have to send out a fleet of manned vehicles that are attached with cameras, sensors, LiDAR, and every single other camera equipment you can think of to create high-definition maps of the area. This process can take months, which is why Waymo is only available in a couple of cities in the United States. To fully commercialize and make autonomous vehicles cars available to everyone, either a faster way to map or taking mapping out of the equation has to be invented. Driving is a social process. People look at each other's facial and physical reactions to judge the other's intent and respond accordingly. Well, self-driving cars can't do that. Even if we're able to attach another camera to monitor other drivers, it will still not properly simulate this social interaction. Currently, autonomous vehicles use prediction algorithms that are built upon billions of data points to predict where surrounding cars are going. But this doesn't effectively simulate the driving interactions. I propose a self-driving car law that requires every autonomous vehicle on the road to communicate its path to all the self-driving cars in that area or intersection. This would allow these cars to effectively plan their path without taking the risk of crashing into another car, because if all the cars can communicate with each other, driving turns into a search problem. You have a starting point and an end point. You then have to find the most optimal path that does not coincide with any other cars. If a good concentration of cars in an area are autonomous, this approach will make car crashes obsolete. Another problem with self-driving car goes a lot into what is moral and ethical behavior. Let's look at a scenario where a self-driving car is in a situation where it's going to crash into something and possibly kill someone. Given that, would it rather crash into an old man or a young child, a beggar or a doctor, 2 passengers or 3 pedestrians? See, for humans, this isn't a problem because these types of situations are always time-bounded. With only milliseconds to make a decision, humans don't decide at all. The scenario they choose is solely based on their reaction, which is completely out of their control, unlike a machine, which can think and respond in that time frame. Moral Machine is a study done by MIT's Media Lab, which asked volunteers to pick between these scenarios. What they found was that people preferred saving younger over older people, humans over pets, people with a higher education than lower. Based on the MIT Media Lab's finding, I propose a cost function to determine which scenario to pick. The cost function would assign each available scenario a cost based on the people that are going to be part of it. A younger person would have a greater cost than an older one. A person following the law would add onto the cost, while a person breaking the law would only add a very small amount to the cost. Following these rules, the car would pick a scenario that would minimize the cost. This cost function seems like a really good idea, but is very subjective, and the biases we all currently have might be shaping this idea. But another thing to keep in mind is that the chances of these scenarios occurring are pretty slim. Security is going to be a huge problem for self-driving cars. If we aren't able to make the cars unhackable, I envision a scenario where a kidnapper doesn't need to physically kidnap you. He could just hack into your self-driving car, change the location, and lock all the doors. There would be nothing you could do to stop it, and we need to come up with solutions to stop this problem. Let's look at an example. Tesla. Tesla is fully built using the cloud, which allows them to update their cars from any location. However, this also allows anyone who can hack into their cloud architecture full control of every single Tesla car on the road. To put that into perspective, there are over 1 million Tesla vehicles on the road at any given moment, and each one of those vehicles would be in control of a malicious hacker that can essentially put millions of lives in danger. The solution would have to include a way to override the autonomous algorithm and also make it almost impossible to hack it to any car. Recent studies in quantum cryptography have proven to be effective in making something unhackable, but we're still very far from making all cars unhackable. So these are some of the problems that need to be solved that otherwise would hinder the future of self-driving cars. Given these, even if we achieve level 5 autonomy just like Elon Musk promised with his car company Tesla, it would only create more problems. The only way to have a brighter future with self-driving cars would be to solve all the problems previously mentioned, like mapping, ethics, security, and radar. Thank you for listening.
Right as the umbilical cord of the Apollo 11 spacecraft was severed from the launch tower, an internal mission timer started. This timer, this pulse, lived within the very heart of the spacecraft, the Apollo guidance computer. And from then on, the Apollo guidance computer handled much of the running of the spacecraft, from calculating the trajectory needed to reach the moon to actually flying the spacecraft through an autopilot program. The computer that took humans to the moon over 50 years ago was a 70-pound, $200,000 box. Modern computers and processors that we're used to in our phones, tablets, laptops, and cars are all much faster, much smaller, and much cheaper. So one of the core components of a computer is the CPU, or Central Processing Unit. The CPU is made up of millions and now billions of transistors, and up until recently, the transistor count on a CPU would double every 18 months. And more transistors generally means faster, more powerful computers. This observation was made by Gordon Moore, working at Intel, and it's been a trend that's held up for over 55 years, which is a lot of doubling. But transistors can only get so small, and this trend of growth that followed Moore's law, it's slowing down. This doesn't mean that transistors won't get any smaller in the future, it just means that now it's far more expensive to shrink them by small amounts because of fundamental physical problems like quantum effects at that scale. Now I've mentioned how computers have gotten much faster in this manner following Moore's law, but here's a question. Do they feel faster? This is the dichotomy between computer hardware and computer software. Computer hardware has gotten faster at this incredible exponential rate. And yet, for some reason, computers don't ever feel twice as fast, do they? In fact, computers have gotten slower by some measures. The latency between typing a key on the keyboard and having that key show up on your screen has increased over time generally. There are many factors that go into explaining why, but let's start with software. Moore's law actually has a software counterpart that explains this phenomena. It's called Wirth's law. Wirth's law, first described by Nicholas Wirth in a 1995 essay titled A Plea for Lean Software, says that while computer hardware has been getting faster at this exponential rate, computer software has gotten slower at an even faster rate. There's a saying that goes, "What Intel giveth, Microsoft taketh away." This slowing down of software, or software bloat, as it's called, happens for several reasons. One of the main reasons that Wirth describes is that software slows down because it can. What I mean is that if hardware keeps getting faster and faster, programmers are able to write more inefficient programs that still seem reasonable to run, and in fact get faster every couple of years. For a while, if a programmer wrote a program and didn't change it at all, Moore's law would make that program twice as fast in 18 months. This leads to companies shipping software that is far less efficient than possible. A second reason for software bloat is consumer ignorance. When we, the consumers, don't realize that programs can be much faster than they are today, we're okay with worse products. We accept that some websites take several seconds and even several megabytes of data to load something as simple as a recipe website. Note that the original video game of Doom was around 2.4 megabytes. Most recipe websites I'm able to find, there's 6 or more megabytes. We're okay with the Windows search functionality taking anywhere from 10 seconds to more than half a minute to search our computers for files when there are tools and techniques from the 90s that can search every file of a computer in less than a second. Because the average user doesn't realize how inefficient most of the software we use on a day-to-day basis is, none of it gets better. The third reason for the increase of software bloat is complexity. The software that we use every day is extremely complex. There's even a law for this. It's called Zawinski's law, which states that, quote, "Every program attempts to expand until it can read mail. Those programs which cannot so expand are replaced by ones which can," end quote. Maybe email isn't as important as it once was, but this law isn't about the specifics, but rather about how programs tend towards adding more and more features. A good example of this type of bloat is popular social media platforms. Take Instagram, for example. Instagram started out as an image sharing website and app, and now it's got messaging, shopping, and Reels built into it. This isn't just Instagram. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and even LinkedIn all have messaging built in. It seems as though all these sites tend towards having a messaging system. And of course, websites aren't the only offender when it comes to excessive features and feature creep. Numerous desktop programs try and do as many things as possible. in general, the more things you want a program to do, the larger and more bloated the program becomes, especially if features do not fit well with the original design. Finally, there are numerous economic factors involved. One economic factor is that customer dependence is more profitable than customer education. This is to say that even if it's more expensive for a company to hire tons of IT staff to answer every questions of users of their software, it's still preferable to actually educating the users because the company can sell customer service, making users dependent on the company. Another economic factor is time pressure. When software companies move fast and break things, it ends up having a detrimental effect to the quality of code produced. This mentality discourages careful planning and instead encourages building up a large code base on a shaky foundation. A final factor is that programmers tend to trade off performance for convenience. We do this through using higher and higher levels of abstraction. So what's the level of abstraction? Well, it's a computational layer that gives a higher level picture of a complex lower level. We're abstracting away details. So as an example, let's go through some common layers of abstraction in a modern computer. The layers, in order from closest to the hardware to the furthest away from the hardware, are the CPU layer, a compiled language layer, and then the interpreted language layer. So the CPU layer, this is right on the hardware. This is where all the computation happens. The CPU takes in binary machine code and performs basic operations like adds, multiplies, and manipulating memory and so on. Above that is the compiled language layer, and it's made up of programming languages like C, which have compilers. A compiler is a program that takes this high-level code in a language like C and converts it into equivalent machine code that runs on the CPU. These compiled languages make it far easier for programmers to do their job without needing to know the nitty-gritty of what exactly the CPU is doing at every moment in time. And finally, above that, the interpreted language layer, it's this layer with programming languages like Python, which are languages that depend on a program called an interpreter. So when you run a program that's written in something like Python, the interpreter figures out what the program has to do at the exact moment that you're running it. So while this allows programmers to be even more flexible, this also tends to be orders of magnitude slower than a compiled language. And a prime example of programs that you probably use on a day-to-day basis in this sort of interpreter layer are websites. Websites are essentially programs that you download and are interpreted by a web browser to be displayed in a certain way. The further up the layers you go, the slower programs tend to be. And more programs are being made in this less efficient manner. So now we know why software bloat occurs. How can we fix it? How can we harness the incredible hardware that many of us have access to? So the first reason for software bloat I mentioned was that software gets bloated because hardware allows it to. Well, Moore's law is slowing down. The performance increase that used to take 18 months for doubling to occur, it's now taking much longer. And so for programs to really speed up, software really does need to get better. Part of the reason I'm giving this talk is to tackle the second reason for software bloat, consumer ignorance. I find that while many programmers sort of know about this problem, much of the general public isn't aware or has noticed but never really knew what they were experiencing. By raising awareness, more consumers will know what to expect, and there will be an increased demand for software that is efficient. Complexity, along with economic factors, are both hard issues that I don't believe have easy answers. But there are ways we can move to get closer to a future with simpler, more cost-effective software that works for both consumers and the companies producing the software. So to challenge the current complexity of programs, we can turn to something called the Unix philosophy. The Unix philosophy is a set of principles for creating simple but powerful systems of programs, which originated with the creation of the Unix operating system. The Unix philosophy can be summarized as write programs that do one thing and do it well, and write programs that work together. So here's an example. Imagine you want to add a feature to a program. This is a program that just outputs some text. And this new feature you want to add to it is you want to number the lines of this text. Well, instead of adding this feature to the current program, you can write a separate program that takes in the output of that first program and adds lines to it. And by doing this, not only did you avoid bloating the original program, but you created a second, more general program that allows you to add this feature to any number of programs. This simple and modular approach to programs is something that programs should strive to follow if we want to move towards a future with less software bloat. And finally, for the economic factors, in the original essay by Worth actually demonstrates that it's possible to create a commercially viable program with substantially fewer resources in less time than usual. All you need is careful planning, iteration, and a goal in mind. Even today, nearly 26 years later after the essay written by Worth, I believe that it's still possible to create great software without sacrificing performance and while also costing less to companies producing the software. I would like to end with a further reason for why software bloat is a real problem. Besides improvements for the quality of life of people living in developed countries, reducing software bloat will make programs more accessible to those in developing countries without access to the fastest internet or the latest processor. Software bloat is a barrier to humanity harnessing the full potential of the modern computer. And I'm hopeful that with programmers and the general population striving for more efficiency, software will be faster than ever. Thank you very much.
This year was a difficult one for many of us. We already had to adapt to our roles as juniors and seniors. But this year, we had to do it in a completely unprecedented way.
In spite of it all, we were able to grow. We were able to grow students, preparing ourselves for the future, and we were able to grow as leaders, taking inspiration from those who came before us.
We could only do so with each other's help. When someone struggled, we were there to lift them up. When someone cried out, we were there to hear them out.
The original meaning of the word Renaissance was rebirth. Now, as we prepare to welcome the rebirth of our communities and our lives, we will face a lot of challenges along the way.
But what this year has taught us is that there is no challenge too big to overcome. If we confront these challenges head on, with our friends by our side, all working together as one, we can do anything. Thank you for coming to TedxYouth TAMS. We'll see you next year.